On the morning of September 22nd, 1952, a thick fog swallowed San Francisco Bay, turning Alcatraz Island into a concrete tomb completely isolated from the civilized world. Inside Block D, the most notorious segregation unit of the harshest federal prison in America, the air thickened, carrying the smell of sea salt, the smell of rusting steel, and the smell of a riot waiting to explode. This wasn't a normal morning. The guards, men who were accustomed to the constant tension of the rock, could feel the difference. The silence, an unnatural silence, heavier than the slamming of iron doors, that violated the familiar noisy rhythm of the prison, and that signaled that the fragile order maintained by batons and tear gas was about to be broken. At the center of that silence was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. In 1952, Bumpy was 46 years old. He was no longer the reckless young man who had walked into the Lexington Hotel to negotiate with Al Capone in 1928. He was now a living legend, an uncrowned king serving time in a place designed to break the will of the most stubborn men. But Alcatraz hadn't broken Bumpy. Instead, it seemed to have only made him sharper, colder, and dangerous in a way that guards couldn't write up in a violation report. While other inmates, bank robbers, murderers, washed-up gangsters, were restless, glancing at each other with eyes full of hidden meaning, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly in his cramped cell. He was playing chess, alone. The chessboard was the only place in Alcatraz where Bumpy could completely control the outcome, but for those who understood, the way Bumpy moved those worn wooden pieces was exactly how he maneuvered the men around him. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to flex his muscles. Bumpy's power in Alcatraz, just like in Harlem, came from intellect and patience. It was the kind of power that made even the most racist criminals of the Aryan Brotherhood hesitate, and that made the most brutal guards think twice before choosing him as a target. But that balance was being threatened. Tension at Alcatraz had been escalating for weeks, not because of the poor food, not because of the cold dampness of the cells, but because of a shift in the administration. A new deputy warden had been transferred in, bringing with him a brutal, punitive mindset and a specific contempt for black inmates. He wanted to reestablish order. He wanted to prove that there were no kings in Alcatraz, only numbers printed on prison uniforms. And the target he chose to make an example of was, inevitably, the Black brothers under Bumpy's silent protection. The provocation started small. A food tray accidentally knocked over. A letter from home lost in the mail. A racial slur muttered while passing in the corridor. Bumpy saw it all. He heard it all. But he did nothing. Bumpy's inaction confused many. The younger, hot-blooded inmates wanted to retaliate immediately. They looked to Bumpy, waiting for a nod, a command, a sign, allowing them to turn the mess hall into a battlefield. But Bumpy remained silent. He understood something the hotheads didn't. In prison, fighting isn't hard. Knowing when to fight is hard. Violence without strategy is just suicide. Bumpy was waiting. He was waiting for the opponent, the system, to make a mistake. He was giving the enemy enough rope to hang himself. And on that morning of September 22nd, the noose tightened. The rumor traveled through the water pipes, through whispers during recreation. A young black inmate, who had arrived at Alcatraz only 2 days prior, had been savagely beaten in the hole simply for refusing to bow his head to the new deputy warden. The rumor said he had broken ribs, was denied medical attention, and was lying on the cold concrete waiting to die. This was the line. In the underworld, there are rules that aren't written down but must be obeyed. You can take a man's freedom, but you cannot strip away his dignity without expecting consequences. When the system fails to maintain minimum justice, violence speaks to reestablish order. Bumpy Johnson looked up from the chessboard. He looked out into the corridor, where his fellow inmates were looking back with burning eyes, waiting. Patience had ended. The time for diplomacy was over. Bumpy stood up, slowly, adjusting his prison collar. He didn't say a word, but the message was transmitted clearer than any loudspeaker. Today, Alcatraz would burn, and Bumpy Johnson would show the world why, even in this hell on earth, he remained untouchable. The sound of an electric buzzer in Alcatraz is usually the sound of routine. It means wake up, stand up, move out. But on September 22nd, when the heavy steel bars of Block D slid open with their mechanical groan, the buzzer didn't signal routine. It signaled war. The explosion wasn't instantaneous. It didn't happen like in the movies where everyone screams at once. It happened with a terrifying precision, a delay of 3 seconds that felt like an hour. The guards on the floor, gripping their batons, expected the inmates to shuffle out for count. Instead, the inmates stepped out and stood still. 150 men, silent, facing the control booth. Then, Bumpy Johnson stepped out of cell 204. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked up at the gun gallery where the riflemen were stationed, and he nodded. Just a slight tilt of the chin. That was the spark. The cell block erupted. But this wasn't a mindless brawl. This was targeted retribution. The anger that had been simmering for weeks didn't spill out randomly. It was poured directly onto the specific guards who had enforced the new deputy warden's sadistic policies. It was violence, yes, but it was organized violence. In the center of the swirling melee flying trays, swinging fists, the sickening thud of batons against ribs, Bumpy Johnson walked. He didn't run. He didn't throw a punch. He moved through the chaos like a ghost, or perhaps like a shark moving through a school of frenzied fish. What happened next became part of prison mythology. As Bumpy walked down the center of the range, the fighting literally parted around him. An Aryan inmate, usually a sworn enemy of the black population, stopped mid-swing to let Bumpy pass. A guard, bleeding from a cut above his eye, saw Bumpy approaching and instinctively backed away, pressing himself against the bars, terrified not of the riot, but of the man walking calmly through it. This was the untouchable status in its rawest form. In a place defined by physical dominance, Bumpy's dominance was psychological. He didn't need to touch you to hurt you. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard above the sirens that were now wailing across the island. From the safety of the elevated catwalk, the new deputy warden watched his authority disintegrate. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He had expected resistance. He had expected a few fights he could crush with solitary confinement. He hadn't expected this. He was watching a system he thought he controlled, being dismantled by a man he thought he had broken. Bumpy reached the end of the tier and stopped directly under the deputy warden's position. The riot raged behind him, a symphony of rage he had composed but was no longer conducting. He didn't look back at the violence. He looked up, straight at the man who had tried to humiliate his people. Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't shout insults. He simply stood there, amidst the tear gas that was beginning to fill the air, staring up with a look of absolute, terrifying indifference. It was a look that said, "You have the keys, you have the guns, but I have the men, and you will never, ever control this rock as long as I am breathing." The deputy warden realized in that moment that he had made a fatal calculation error. He had treated Bumpy Johnson like a criminal, failing to recognize that he was dealing with a general. And generals don't fight in the trenches. They reshape the battlefield. The tear gas canisters hit the floor with a hiss, spewing white smoke. The tactical team was breaching the doors. The riot was about to be suppressed by overwhelming force, but the message had already been delivered. The violence was just the envelope. The message was Bumpy standing untouched in the center of hell. The physical riot lasted exactly 42 minutes. That was how long it took for the tear gas to flood the lungs of D-Block and for the tactical teams to bludgeon the resistance into submission. But as Bumpy had calculated, the physical battle was just the opening move. The real war, the psychological war, was about to begin in the silence of the whole. They didn't drag Bumpy to solitary confinement. They didn't need to. When the order came, he turned around, placed his hands behind his back, and allowed them to cuff him. He walked to the isolation unit with the same dignity he would have used walking into a jazz club in Harlem. This infuriated the guards. They wanted him to struggle. They wanted an excuse to use their batons. By denying them that excuse, Bumpy won the first round of the aftermath before he even entered the cell. Cell 14 inches, the isolation wing was designed to break men. It was a concrete box, completely dark, stripping away all sensory input. No light, no sound, no time. Just the cold dampness of the rock and the beating of your own heart. Most men started screaming after 6 hours. They would hallucinate, beg, bargain with God or the devil just to see a flicker of light. Bumpy Johnson didn't scream. He sat in the lotus position on the freezing floor, closed his eyes, and retreated into his mind palace. For 3 days, the administration left him there. They cut his rations. They turned the temperature down. They waited for him to break. But every time the guards slid the viewing slot open, expecting to see a broken man curled in the fetal position, they saw Bumpy sitting upright, calm, meditating. He wasn't enduring the punishment. He was transcending it. On the 4th day, the steel door creaked open. The new deputy warden stood there, his silhouette framed by the blinding hallway light. He stepped in, his boots clicking on the concrete, trying to project dominance. "You think you're smart, Johnson?" the deputy warden sneered, his voice echoing in the small box. "You think starting a riot makes you a king? Look at you. You're in a cage, naked, cold, hungry. Where is your army now?" Bumpy opened his eyes. He didn't blink at the sudden light. He looked up at the warden, his expression unreadable. "You mistake geography for power," Bumpy said. His voice was raspy from dehydration, but steady. "You have locked up my body. Congratulations. But you haven't locked up the problem. In fact, you've just made it worse." The warden laughed, a nervous, hollow sound. "Worse? I have D Block on lockdown. I have your lieutenants in the infirmary. I have total control." "Control?" Bumpy shifted slightly. "You have compliance, not control. And compliance, born of fear, has an expiration date. You see, Warden, before today, I was just a gangster to these men. But by putting me in here, by trying to break me and failing, you are turning me into a martyr. Every hour I stay in this box without screaming, my legend grows out there. And when I eventually walk out, and I will walk out, I won't just be Bumpy Johnson anymore. I will be the man who beat the rock." The warden stiffened. He realized with a sinking feeling that Bumpy was right. The silence from cell 14 wasn't defeat. It was a broadcast. The entire prison population was waiting to see who would blink first. "I can keep you in here forever," the warden threatened, but the conviction was gone from his voice. "No, you can't," Bumpy replied softly, "because if you keep me here, the rest of the prison stops working. The laundry stops, the kitchen stops, the machine shop stops. You need their labor to run this island, and they won't work for the man who is torturing their symbol. You have a choice, Warden. You can keep your pride and lose your prison. Or you can let me out, treat my men with respect, and I will give you your order back." The warden stood there for a long moment, the weight of the decision crushing him. He was the one with the keys, but in that dark, cold cell, he was the one who was trapped. Alcatraz was not just a prison, it was a factory. It was a machine designed to extract labor from men who had nothing else to give. The laundry cleaned uniforms for the military. The mat shop produced rubber mats for the Navy. This industrial rhythm was the heartbeat of the island. On day 5 of Bumpy Johnson's isolation, the heartbeat stopped. It began in the laundry sector, the largest work detail on the island. At 8 hours, the steam whistles blew, signaling the start of the shift. But the machines remained silent. No steam hissed, no conveyor belts moved. The inmates stood at their stations, arms crossed, staring at the floor. They didn't refuse to go to work. They simply refused to work. The foreman, a civilian contractor who usually got along with the cons, shouted orders. He was ignored. He threatened to write them up. He was ignored. It was as if the men had turned into statues. This was the passive resistance strategy that Bumpy had discussed in the yard months earlier, inspired not by Gandhi, but by the brutal pragmatism of the streets. If they want to treat us like animals, we will stop being machines. Word reached the warden's office within minutes. Production was down. Deadlines for military contracts were being missed. The warden stormed into the laundry room, flanked by armed guards. He saw the stillness and felt the cold sweat of a man losing control of his kingdom. "Get to work," the warden bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation, "or I will throw every single one of you in the hole." A young inmate, one of Bumpy's protégés from Harlem, slowly lifted his head. He didn't look at the warden with fear. He looked at him with pity. "We can't work, Warden," he said, his voice calm. The machines are broken. Broken? What are you talking about? The spirit of the machine is gone, the inmate replied cryptically. It's sitting in cell 14. The metaphor hit the warden like a physical blow. They weren't just striking, they were negotiating, and they were doing it without their leader saying a single word. Bumpy Johnson, sitting in absolute darkness hundreds of yards away, was ghost managing the entire facility. The warden ordered the guards to beat the ringleaders, but who were the ringleaders? Every man was doing the exact same thing. To punish one, he would have to punish them all. And if he put everyone in solitary, who would cook the food? Who would clean the halls? Who would fix the boilers? By noon, the kitchen staff had joined the strike. Lunch was not served. By 14, the maintenance crew sat down. The boilers began to lose pressure. Alcatraz was effectively paralyzed. The most secure prison in the world, the fortress that held Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly, had been defeated by silence. Back in cell 14, Bumpy Johnson knew exactly what was happening. He didn't need a radio. He could feel it in the vibrations of the floor, in the frantic footsteps of the guards running past his door. He smiled in the dark. He moved a pawn on his mental chessboard. Check. The warden retreated to his office, pouring himself a stiff drink. He looked out the window at the San Francisco skyline, so close, yet so far away. He realized he had two choices. He could call in the Marines, admit he had lost control, and end his career in disgrace. Or he could do the unthinkable. He could negotiate with the ghost. He put down his glass. He picked up the keys to the isolation unit. He was going back down to the hole, not as a conqueror this time, but as a man who needed to make a deal. The sound of the key turning in the lock of cell 14 was the loudest sound in the universe. It wasn't just metal on metal. It was the sound of authority admitting defeat. The heavy steel door swung open. The warden stood there, silhouetted against the harsh artificial light of the corridor. He looked different than he had 5 days ago. His uniform was still pressed, but his shoulders slumped. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the absolute darkness of the hole to find Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the lotus position, shirtless, his skin blending into the shadows. He didn't blink. He didn't shield his eyes. He looked at the warden as if he were a guest arriving late for a dinner party. "You look tired, warden," Bumpy said. His voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. The warden stepped inside, closing the door partially behind him to block out the curious ears of the guards. "The laundry is down," the warden said, his voice tight. "The kitchen is down. The maintenance crews are refusing to fix the boilers. The island is freezing." "It's a cold world," Bumpy replied cryptically. "Sometimes men need to feel the cold to appreciate the heat." "Cut the philosophy, Johnson," the warden snapped, though there was no bite in it. "What do you want? You want extra rations? You want library privileges? You want me to transfer the deputy warden?" Bumpy slowly unfolded his legs and stood up. For a man who hadn't eaten a full meal in 5 days, he moved with terrifying grace. He walked until he was inches from the warden. The height difference was negligible, but Bumpy seemed to tower over the man who held the keys. "I don't want favors," Bumpy said. "Favors are for snitches. I want justice. And justice, in this place, is a transaction." Bumpy began to list his terms. He didn't ask for the impossible. He didn't ask for escape. He asked for the structural changes that would restore dignity to the black inmates. "First," Bumpy said, counting on his fingers, "the racial segregation in the dining hall ends. If we work together in the laundry, we eat together at the table. Second, the beatings stop. If a man breaks a rule, put him in the hole. But if your guards touch him, the machines stop again. And third," Bumpy paused, leaning in closer, "the deputy warden leaves, not transferred, fired. I want him walked off this rock in front of everyone, so my men can see that their silence bought his ticket home." The warden shook his head. "I can't fire a deputy warden because an inmate told me to. Washington would have my head." "Washington doesn't care about your deputy," Bumpy countered. "Washington cares about the military contracts you are missing right now. Washington cares that the Navy isn't getting its uniforms. You have a choice, warden. You can sacrifice one sadist to save your career, or you can go down with the ship." Because I promise you, as long as he is here, not a single shirt gets pressed on this island." The silence stretched. The warden calculated the cost. He looked at Bumpy, a man stripped of everything, yet holding all the cards. He realized that Bumpy understood the bureaucracy of the prison system better than the administrators did. Bumpy knew that in the end, Alcatraz was a business, and bad management was worse than a riot. "If I do this," the warden whispered, "the strike ends immediately. Tonight. The moment I walk out of this cell," Bumpy corrected, "my men need to see me. They need to know the deal is sealed." The warden nodded slowly. "A pact with the devil, perhaps, but a pact that would turn the lights back on. Get dressed, Johnson. You're going back to D Block." Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, accepted his clothes from the guard, and dressed with methodical slowness. As he walked out of the hole, leaving the darkness behind, he didn't look like a prisoner being released. He looked like a CEO leaving a boardroom after a hostile takeover. The king was returning to his throne. News travels fast in prison, but silence travels faster. When Bumpy Johnson walked out of the isolation unit, he was escorted by 2 guards. But this time, they weren't gripping his arms. They were walking a step behind him. It was a subtle shift in body language, but in the hyper-observant world of Alcatraz, it was screaming. He was led straight to the dining hall. It was 17 hours, dinner time. Usually, the dining hall was a cacophony of scraping forks, shouting voices, and clattering trays. Today, it was a tomb. 300 men sat at long steel tables, their hands on their laps, their food untouched. The steam from the mashed potatoes rose into the air, the only thing moving in the room. The guards opened the main gate. Bumpy stepped inside. Every head turned. The Aryan Brotherhood at the front tables, the Italian mobsters in the middle, the black inmates at the back. They were all looking for one thing. Was he broken? Did he shuffle? Did he look down? Bumpy paused at the entrance. He scanned the room. He saw the racial lines drawn invisible but thick between the tables. And then he made his move. He didn't go to the back of the line. He walked to the steam table, took a tray, and received his ration. Then, instead of heading to the designated colored section, he walked to a table near the center neutral ground. He sat down, he picked up his fork, and he took a bite. That was the signal. As if a spell had been broken, 300 men picked up their forks simultaneously. The sound was like a thunderclap. The strike was over, not because the warden ordered it, but because Bumpy Johnson ate. But the deal wasn't fully closed yet. There was one more condition. As the men ate, the side door of the dining hall opened. The deputy warden appeared, not in his uniform, but in a gray civilian suit, carrying a cardboard box. He was flanked by 2 federal marshals. The chewing stopped. The deputy warden had to walk the length of the dining hall to reach the exit that led to the dock. This was the walk of shame Bumpy had negotiated. The man who had terrorized D Block, who had tried to break the spirit of the inmates, was now being paraded in front of them like a captured flag. He kept his eyes on the floor, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and humiliation. He could feel the eyes of the men burning into him. He could feel Bumpy's gaze most of all. As he passed Bumpy's table, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked up, perhaps to offer one last glare of defiance. But Bumpy didn't even look at him. Bumpy was busy buttering a piece of bread, completely dismissing the man's existence. It was the ultimate insult. "You are not worth my anger. You are not worth my attention. You are just an obstacle that has been removed." The heavy iron door slammed shut behind the deputy warden, echoing through the hall. He was gone, exiled from the rock. A low murmur started in the room. It wasn't a cheer. Cheering would bring the guards down on them. It was a hum, a vibration of respect. The men looked at Bumpy, then they looked at their food, and they ate with the appetite of men who had just won a war without firing a single shot. Up on the catwalk, the warden watched it all. He gripped the railing, realizing the terrifying truth of what he had just done. He had restored order to his prison, yes, but he had done so by validating a new authority. He had officially recognized Bumpy Johnson as the Prime Minister of Alcatraz. Power abhors a vacuum. When the deputy warden was removed, a space opened up in the hierarchy of Alcatraz. the federal government appointed a replacement, a bureaucrat from Washington who was more interested in paperwork than punishment. But everyone on the island knew that the real replacement didn't wear a uniform. For the next 6 months, a strange phenomenon occurred at Alcatraz: peace. The stabbing rate dropped by 60%. The number of fights in the shower room fell to almost zero. To an outsider, it looked like the rehabilitation programs were finally working. But the guards in the gun galleries knew better. They knew that the peace wasn't natural, it was enforced. Bumpy Johnson had become the shadow warden. The deal he made in Cell 14 was a two-way street. The administration gave the inmates dignity, better food, integration in the dining hall, an end to arbitrary beatings. In exchange, Bumpy gave them order. And Bumpy's version of order was stricter than any federal regulation. One afternoon in the recreation yard, the strength of this new system was tested. A young inmate from Detroit, new to the Rock and eager to make a name for himself, pulled a shiv on a member of the Italian crew over a gambling debt. In the old days, this would have sparked a race riot. The whistles would blow, the tear gas would fly, and bodies would be carried out on stretchers. Up in the tower, the rifleman tensed, his finger hovering over the trigger. He was trained to shoot at the first sign of lethal violence. But before the guard could fire, a shadow fell over the young inmate. Bumpy Johnson didn't run over. He simply walked into the circle. He didn't look at the Italian who was about to be stabbed. He looked at the kid from Detroit. "Is this how you repay me?" Bumpy asked. His voice was low, barely audible over the wind coming off the bay. The kid's hand shook. "He owes me, Bumpy. It's principle." "Principle?" Bumpy scoffed. "Principle is what got us better food. Principle is why you aren't being beaten in the hole right now. What you are doing is ego, and your ego is about to cost everyone on this yard their privileges." Bumpy extended his hand. Palm open, expectant. "Give me the knife." The entire yard held its breath. The kid looked at the shiv, then at the Italian, then at the guard tower. But mostly, he looked at Bumpy's eyes, eyes that had seen more violence than this kid could dream of. The kid lowered his arm. He placed the shiv in Bumpy's hand. Bumpy didn't throw it away. He slipped it into his pocket. "You're fined," Bumpy said. 50% of your commissary for the next 3 months goes to him. That's the interest on the debt. Now, shake hands and get out of my face." The two men shook hands. The circle dispersed. The guard in the tower slowly took his finger off the trigger. He lowered his rifle and looked down at the yard with a mixture of relief and unease. He realized then that Bumpy Johnson saved him from filling out a shooting report. He realized that Bumpy Johnson was doing the job that the guards couldn't do. That evening, the warden reviewed the incident report. It was blank. No violence reported. He looked out at the cell block, where the lights were dimming for the night. He hated admitting it, even to himself. But the most essential employee of the Federal Bureau of Prisons was a man serving a life sentence. Bumpy had proven that the most effective way to control a prison wasn't with walls or guns, but with a code, and he was the only man who could interpret that code. But peace built on power always attracts envy. And while the guards were pacified, a new threat was rising from within the inmate population, a threat that didn't care about peace or profits. Peace in prison is a fragile thing. It is an unnatural state, and like any unnatural state, it requires constant energy to maintain. But as the months dragged on, a dangerous idea began to take root in the minds of the younger, hungrier inmates. Maybe the king has lost his teeth. Enter Cyrus. Cyrus was 24 years old, built like a linebacker, and serving 40 years for armed robbery and double homicide. He didn't care about chess. He didn't care about strategic silence. He belonged to the new generation of criminals who believed that power was measured solely by the volume of your voice and the size of your fists. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, a middle-aged man reading philosophy books and playing chess, and he didn't see a general. He saw a target. The disrespect started gradually. It was a test. In the prison library, Bumpy had a designated chair. It wasn't marked, but everyone knew. That is Bumpy's chair. For 3 years, no one had dared to sit in it. On a Tuesday afternoon, Cyrus walked into the library. He saw the empty chair. He saw Bumpy standing at the bookshelf, his back turned. Cyrus sat down. The silence that fell over the library was suffocating. Inmates froze mid-page. The librarian, a nervous little man serving time for fraud, pretended to sort index cards, terrified to look up. Bumpy turned around. He held a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince. He saw Cyrus sitting in his chair, feet up on the table, grinning. This was the moment everyone expected Bumpy to act. In the old world, the response would be immediate violence. A book to the face, a shank to the neck. You cannot let a challenge like this go unanswered. But Bumpy didn't move toward Cyrus. He didn't even frown. He simply looked at the young man, then looked at the clock on the wall. "Comfortable?" Bumpy asked. His voice was polite, almost grandfatherly. "It's a free country," Cyrus sneered, looking around at his crew for validation. "I don't see your name on it, old man." Bumpy nodded slowly. "You're right. It's just a chair. Enjoy the view." And then Bumpy Johnson walked away. He left the library. The reaction in the prison was electric. Bumpy walked away. The rumors spread like wildfire. The old lion is tired. He's scared. He's done. Cyrus felt invincible. He had stared down the king of Alcatraz and won. Over the next week, he grew bolder. He began to tax Bumpy's lower-level associates. He cut in line in the dining hall. He spoke loudly about how it was time for new management in D-Block. He gathered a crew of dissatisfied muscle, young men who wanted the glory of toppling a legend. They prepared for a war, sharpening shivs, stealing pipes from the machine shop. They expected Bumpy to rally his troops for a massive confrontation in the yard. But Bumpy did nothing. He stayed in his cell. He played his chess. He let Cyrus strut around the prison like a peacock. To the untrained eye, it looked like surrender. But Bumpy wasn't surrendering. He was executing a strategy known in the art of war as the empty fort. He knew that Cyrus was a virus. And you don't fight a virus by attacking it directly. You let it multiply until it kills its own host. Bumpy knew that Cyrus's aggression wasn't just a problem for him, it was a problem for everyone. By letting Cyrus run wild, by refusing to check him, Bumpy was allowing Cyrus to annoy the Italians, to irritate the Aryans, to scare the neutrals. Bumpy was letting Cyrus turn the entire prison against himself. He wasn't avoiding the fight. He was simply waiting for the moment when he wouldn't have to fight alone. He was waiting for the moment when the execution of Cyrus wouldn't look like a gang war, but like a public service. In the ecosystem of a prison, there is a concept known as political capital. Bumpy Johnson had spent 3 years accumulating it. Cyrus had spent 3 weeks burning it. By the second week of Cyrus's reign of terror, the atmosphere in the yard had shifted from annoyance to genuine hostility. Cyrus had made the fatal mistake of crossing faction lines. He had insulted an Aryan sister during mail call. He had knocked over an Italian mobster's coffee without apologizing. He believed his own hype that he was the new king and forgot that kings who rule by fear alone usually end up with a knife in the back. On a foggy Wednesday morning, the tribunal convened. It wasn't an official meeting. There was no table, no gavel. It happened on the concrete bleachers in the recreation yard, in plain sight of the guards, yet completely invisible to them. Bumpy was sitting in his usual spot, which he had reclaimed simply by arriving early, reading a newspaper. Approaching him from the left was Vinny the Chin, the head of the Italian crew in D-Block. Approaching him from the right was Red Snyder, the shot caller for the Aryan Brotherhood. In the outside world, these 3 men would be mortal enemies. But inside the Rock, they were the board of directors, and they had a personnel issue to discuss. Vinny spoke first, keeping his voice low, his eyes scanning the yard. "The kid is a problem, Bumpy. He's making too much noise. The guards are doubling the patrols because of him. It's bad for business." Red nodded, spitting on the ground. "He disrespected one of my guys yesterday. Under normal rules, I'd have gutted him right there. But we know he's one of yours. We respect the color line." Bumpy folded his newspaper slowly. He placed it on his lap. He looked at Vinny, then at Red. This was the moment his empty fort strategy had been leading to. He hadn't protected Cyrus. He had simply allowed Cyrus to become a liability to everyone, forcing the other leaders to come to Bumpy for a solution. "He is not one of mine," Bumpy said. His voice was cold, devoid of any emotional attachment. He is a free agent, and free agents do not have insurance. Vinny raised an eyebrow. So, if he were to have an accident, there would be no retaliation from Harlem? This was the crux of the negotiation. If the Italians or Aryans hit a black inmate without permission, it would start a race war. They needed Bumpy to sign the death warrant. They needed the green light. Bumpy looked across the yard. He saw Cyrus holding court near the weight pile, laughing loud, oblivious to the fact that his fate was being decided 50 yards away. Bumpy didn't hate Cyrus. He pitied him. Cyrus was a lion who thought he was a hunter, unaware he was just the prey. The ecosystem requires balance, Bumpy said philosophically. When a rabid dog enters the yard, it doesn't matter who owns it. It matters who puts it down. Bumpy reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, a rare luxury. He offered one to Vinny. He offered one to Red. "I am washing my hands of him," Bumpy declared. "Do what you must to restore the quiet, but make it clean. I don't want a lockdown." The deal was struck. The cigarette was the contract. Vinny took the cigarette, nodded respectfully, and walked away. Red did the same. Bumpy watched them leave. He reopened his newspaper. He didn't need to issue an order. He didn't need to get his hands bloody. He had simply withdrawn his protection. He had removed the invisible shield that kept Cyrus alive. In the chess game of Alcatraz, Bumpy had just sacrificed a pawn to secure the loyalty of the knights and bishops. Across the yard, Vinny signaled to his enforcer. Red signaled to his heavy. They began to move toward the weight pile, flanking Cyrus from both sides. The guards in the tower watched, sensing the shift in the wind, but seeing nothing they could write a report about. The young wolf was about to learn the final lesson. In the jungle, silence is not weakness. Silence is the sound of the predator closing in. The end of Cyrus came not with a bang, but with a whisper. It happened at 14 hours near the weight pile. The sun was shining. The guards were watching. But prison violence is a magic trick. It happens in the space between blinks. Cyrus was bench pressing, preparing for the war he thought was coming. He didn't see Vinny's enforcer stumble near the spotter. He didn't see Red's heavy drop a sharpened piece of metal piping. It was a collision, an accident. By the time the guards blew their whistles, Cyrus was bleeding out on the concrete. There were no witnesses. The Aryan who dropped the pipe claimed he slipped. The Italian who pushed him claimed he was pushed. It was a bureaucratic mess, a fog of confusion. 50 yards away, Bumpy Johnson sat at his chessboard. He heard the whistles. He heard the gurneys wheeling frantically across the asphalt. He didn't look up. He didn't flinch. He simply moved his rook to square E4. "Checkmate," Bumpy whispered to the empty chair opposite him. The message was received. The prison returned to its unnatural quiet. The brief, chaotic reign of the young wolf was over, erased as if it never happened. The ecosystem had corrected itself. The departure. 2 years later, in 1954, word came down from the Bureau of Prisons. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was to be transferred. The official reason was administrative redistribution. The real reason was that the warden could no longer tolerate having a prisoner who was more powerful than he was. Bumpy had become a gravitational force that warped the reality of Alcatraz. To run the prison, they had to remove the king. On the day of his departure, something unprecedented happened. Usually, when a prisoner leaves Alcatraz, he is shackled, shoved onto a boat, and forgotten. It is a moment of shame, but as Bumpy walked down the gangway toward the ferry, the yard was silent. The inmates, black, white, Hispanic, stood at the chain-link fences. They didn't cheer. Cheering is for clowns. They stood at attention. It was a silent salute from the army to the general who had won them their dignity. Even the guards seemed to stand a little straighter. They knew that with Bumpy gone, the fragile peace might fracture. They were losing their shadow enforcer. Bumpy stepped onto the boat. He looked back at the imposing concrete walls of the rock one last time. He didn't look at it with fear or hatred. He looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who had walked into the belly of the beast and carved out a home. The legacy. Bumpy Johnson's time at Alcatraz proved something that street violence never could. It proved that true power is not about muscle. It is about leverage. He survived the riot not by fighting, but by becoming the calm center of the storm. He defeated the warden not by shouting, but by weaponizing silence. He eliminated his rival not by murder, but by politics. He taught the underworld a lesson that is still whispered in cell blocks today. If you fight with your fists, you can rule a corner. If you fight with your mind, you can rule the world even from inside a cage. As the ferry cut through the fog of San Francisco Bay, carrying him back toward the mainland and eventually back to Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a gangster. He was a myth. He was the man who went to hell and took over the management. And the files at Alcatraz, buried deep in the archives, tell the story of the only time the federal government lost a war to a single man armed with nothing but a chessboard and a terrifying amount of patience.